Some curses don't come from spell books. They don't need incantations or blood sacrifices. They begin instead in whispers, in the things left unsaid at the dinner table, in the way one generation teaches the next to carry pain without speaking of it. And before long it becomes more than memory. It becomes shape, weight, pattern. Look at your family closely. Really look. Is there something that keeps repeating? A string of failed marriages, a pattern of children born into chaos, addictions passed from father to son like some terrible inheritance, women who see too much and are silenced in different ways, some through violence, some through shame. These are not just patterns of behavior. In the occult world, these are signatures, energetic fingerprints of something deeper, something that lives beneath the surface of your bloodline, because blood remembers. Even when the mind forgets, the body doesn't. And some bloodlines carry more than DNA. They carry unfinished business. Curses are not always cast in rage. Some are born of grief, a mother losing her child and wishing the world would feel her sorrow. A betrayed lover swearing vengeance into the dark, not knowing who would carry the price. Sometimes, it's not even a human who starts it. A wronged spirit. A pact broken generations ago. Or an ancestor who reached too far into something forbidden and left the door open just enough for something to crawl through. And now, it clings to your family name like rot under the floorboards. Every few years it shows itself. Not as a demon in the mirror, but as another tragedy that looks eerily like the last. And those who try to leave, they feel it most, because distance doesn't break blood. Sometimes, it only tightens the thread. You might have grown up being told you're just like your mother, or that you carry your grandfather's temper. But what if it's not just personality? What if you've inherited the residue of decisions made long before you were born? And what if something, or someone, is still feeding off that repetition? You can feel it when it begins to stir. Maybe it's during arguments that spiral out of nowhere, or in moments of sleep paralysis where the air turns to ice, or when you look in the mirror and feel like something is looking back at you. Not foreign, but familiar, like an echo that lives just beneath your skin. This is how bloodline curses survive, quietly, steadily, feeding on the things your family doesn't speak of. And the longer they're left unspoken, the stronger they become. But here's the worst part. Most people don't even know they're cursed. They call it bad luck, a rough life, a string of coincidences. Until one day they look back and realize their life never belonged entirely to them. That something else has been steering, watching, waiting. And if you're the one in your family who sees it, who feels it, then you're not imagining it. You might be the first one strong enough to confront it. When people speak of family, they speak of legacy, of names carried with pride, of traditions held like torches in the dark. But there is another kind of legacy, one that doesn't shine, one that drips slowly down the family tree like oil through bark, thick, clinging, black. And if you trace it carefully, you'll notice something no one wants to admit. It never skips a generation. You may already feel it. The heavy mood that always lingers after a family gathering. The sudden spiral into rage that you can't explain. That you've seen in your father and his father before him. The way women in your bloodline are drawn to partners who dim their light. Or the way children are born into struggle as if fate were already written into their skin. We call it misfortune. But what if it's not? What if it's ritual? Because in the occult, repetition is a spell. And when generations repeat the same pain, the same betrayal, the same loss, something begins to take form. Something learns from the pain. Something feeds from it. Some occult traditions believe that human suffering creates energetic residue, a kind of spiritual waste product that doesn't just vanish. It sinks, it settles. And in families where that suffering is never released or healed, it creates a current, Not a metaphorical one. A real invisible current that pulls people toward the same fates over and over. One miscarriage becomes 2. One alcoholic becomes 3. One suicide becomes a cycle. And the family calls it tragedy. But tragedy that repeats is not tragedy. It's structure. A curse that no one cast, because it no longer needs to be cast. And these threads don't just live in stories. They live in the body. Science might call it trauma passed through epigenetics, but ancient mystics described it as ancestral tethering. The idea that your body may carry the echo of a scream that wasn't yours. The fear of fire though you've never been burned. The hatred of a name you've never spoken. What if the nightmares you've had since childhood are not your imagination, but your inheritance?
There's a reason you can't shake certain feelings, certain people, certain failures. You may think you've chosen your path, but the curse is subtle. It doesn't block the road, it bends it, so that every choice feels like yours, until you arrive exactly where they did, where they always did.
And if you try to resist, the thread pulls tighter. You may find yourself sabotaging relationships that feel too healthy, avoiding opportunities that seem too easy, or waking up in tears after dreaming of someone you've never met, only to find their face in an old family photo, yellowed and buried in a box no one touches. Some families have that box. A drawer that's always jammed, a room that's always locked, a set of stories that go quiet when the children walk in, and within those silences is the curse. Not because someone conjured it, but because no one ever spoke it aloud. The most powerful curses don't need altars, they just need obedience, and most families obey without ever realizing it. So ask yourself, what's been repeating in your family? And more importantly, what part of it is trying to repeat through you? There are names you know, the ones written on certificates, engraved in stone, framed on the wall. But those aren't the ones that hold power. Not in the occult. In every family, there are names that were spoken once and then buried. Names that trembled on the lips of dying relatives. Names whispered behind closed doors or scratched out of Bibles and family trees. And it's often these names, the forgotten ones, that hold the key to the curse. Because curses don't cling to paper, they cling to memory. And memory is not always conscious. Your blood remembers things your mind does not. It starts with questions no one wants to answer. Who was the woman in that faded photograph? The one no one ever mentions, though her face looks like yours. Why was your grandfather never allowed to speak of his brother? Why did your mother flinch at the sound of a certain lullaby? Families don't erase people for no reason. They do it because the story attached to that person is dangerous. And sometimes, that danger isn't metaphorical. Occult practitioners speak often of ancestral gateways, spiritual links that remain open through lineage. When an ancestor invites something in, especially through ritual, trauma, or bloodshed, that gateway doesn't always close when they die. If it isn't sealed, ritually, emotionally, or spiritually, it stays open. And whatever came through can remain tethered, not to the house, not to the object, but to the name, which is why names were once treated as sacred. To speak a name was to summon its essence. To name a child after someone was to offer their soul as an echo. So if a cursed or marked name is repeated, even unknowingly, it can reopen a wound long thought sealed. You might think you chose your name, or that your parents did, but sometimes it was chosen long before either of you were born. This is why patterns repeat, not just because of behavior, but because of resonance. The same names, the same birth dates, the same emotional spirals, a grandson with his great-uncle's rage, a granddaughter who almost drowns at the same age her ancestor did. Even birthmarks, in some traditions, are believed to be symbols of death carried from a past life. or inherited from a relative who died violently. In certain grimoires, there are rituals designed to identify these ancestral phantoms, spirits not of the dead, but of the unresolved. Energy caught mid-transition. They aren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They don't rattle chains or appear in mirrors. They inhabit. They embed themselves in behavior, in fears, in addictions. They speak in the little voice that says, "You'll never be better than this," or "You don't deserve peace." And because it sounds like you believe it, but it isn't you. Not entirely. Some families were touched by forces they couldn't understand. A relative who dabbled in rituals during a time of grief. A pact made in desperation. A prayer answered by something that wasn't God. These moments seem isolated, but their consequences stretch. And if no one intervenes, the curse doesn't just pass on, it evolves. What began as madness in one generation becomes violence in the next. Then addiction, then illness, then stillness. The kind that feels like your life isn't really yours. That you're just acting out scenes written before you were born. That everything you try, every job, every relationship, every fresh start, ends in the same quiet failure. That's how you know the curse is alive. It doesn't stop you. It shapes you, molds you into a vessel for what the bloodline began. And if you're the one asking questions, if you're the one who notices the patterns, who feels the weight of the forgotten, then understand this. You are not cursed by accident. You are cursed by inheritance. And that makes you dangerous. Because once a curse becomes visible, it begins to unravel. But it won't go quietly. There's a reason the names were buried, a reason the stories were erased, not just to protect you, but to protect it. Because whatever clings to your lineage has learned how to survive, through silence, through shame, through the illusion that the past is dead. It isn't. It's breathing through you. There comes a moment, subtle, quiet, almost dismissible, when something inside you speaks, and you realize it isn't entirely your voice. Not a possession, not a scream, not a monstrous invasion. Just a whisper, a suggestion, a shift in the way your thoughts arrange themselves. You might not notice it at first. It shows up in the way you repeat a phrase you've never heard anyone else say. In the way you stare at a certain corner of the room when no one is there, convinced it feels heavier. In the moments of rage or despair that rise too quickly, too violently, emotions that don't feel earned, but overwhelming, like something coming through you rather than from you. This is how the bloodline curse evolves, not by haunting, but by merging, because some energies are not content to stay external. Over time, they enter the bloodstream of thought, and what was once a curse around you becomes a presence within you. In many occult systems, the human body is not just physical, it's layered. Physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. And when a curse persists long enough, it begins to take root not in your surroundings, but in the subtle layers of your being. It influences your reactions. It distorts your self-image. It creates emotional loops you can't break. You think you're sabotaging yourself. But in truth, the curse is speaking, not with words, but with impulse. You see it in dreams too. Recurring symbols that don't make sense. A house you've never been in, but instinctively recognize. A figure standing at the end of a hallway, not chasing, not attacking, just watching. These dreams aren't random, they're maps. And sometimes they're memories, but not yours. Some people call it ancestral trauma. Others call it psychological imprinting. But in the deeper traditions, it's understood as a kind of possession, ancestral entanglement, a fusion between self and story, where the past doesn't just influence your life, it starts living it again through you. You might notice shifts in your voice, the way your handwriting changes when you're upset, the strange sense of déjà vu when you walk into a room you've never been in, yet somehow know. And the more you deny it, the stronger it gets. Because the curse doesn't want to be seen. It wants to be expressed. It wants to continue. Through your decisions, through your relationships, through the way you love, fight, fear, and grieve. There are even moments when you'll feel completely unlike yourself. A sudden desire to isolate, to lash out, to ruin something that was going well. And afterward, you won't know why you did it. You'll apologize maybe, promise to be better. But deep down, you'll feel like a passenger. Like something else took the wheel for a moment. And in a way, it did. Some curses are like parasites, others are like echoes. But the worst kind, the ones tied to blood, they become you, slowly, gently, with affection even. Because the curse doesn't always hate you. Sometimes it loves you. It chose you. It's been waiting for you to become the right shape. And if you're sensitive, if you've always felt a little outside yourself, a little haunted by moods that come from nowhere, then you're more likely to be a conduit. Not a victim, not a puppet, a host. And the most dangerous thing a curse can do is make you believe it's part of you. That the pain is just your personality. That the anger is just your edge. That the emptiness is normal. But it's not. It's ancestral. And when it begins to speak through you, it doesn't announce itself. It disguises itself as intuition, as instinct, as protection. It tells you, don't trust them. When someone kind enters your life, it says, this won't work when something good begins. It whispers, you're better off alone, and smiles when you believe it. That's how it wins. Not with fear, but with familiarity. So if you've ever wondered why your life seems to keep circling the same drain, why your choices always end the same way, no matter how much you try to grow, ask yourself this. Whose voice are you listening to? And if you could silence the echo, who would you become? Curses rarely vanish on their own. They root themselves in silence, in repetition, in pain mistaken for personality. And by the time someone finally decides to break it, the curse has already shaped them. Not just their life, but their identity. Which is why breaking a bloodline curse isn't about defeating something outside of you. It's about unraveling something woven into your name, your habits, your very way of being. You won't find a single ritual to fix it. There is no one spell, no ancient phrase that ends what took generations to create. Breaking a curse like this requires something far more difficult. Awareness, choice, and confrontation. You have to look directly at the parts of your family that have always been avoided. The stories that don't get told. The grief that never found language. The anger passed down like an heirloom. It begins with recognition, with stepping back far enough to see the shape of it all. How your grandmother's silence became your mother's anxiety, and your own inability to trust. How a great-grandfather's betrayal echoes in the way love slips through your fingers. You may feel like a failure, but what you're really feeling is the full weight of a pattern that was never yours to carry. Then comes the naming. This is where most people stop, because naming the curse often means naming people. Not to blame, but to understand. It means looking at the wounds your family caused without shrinking from them. It means saying aloud what was never meant to be spoken. And when you do, the air changes. The story loosens. The hold weakens. Some choose ritual to mark the moment. They light candles for each generation. They write letters and burn them. They speak names into mirrors or rivers or graveyards. But the true power isn't in the ritual. It's in the intention, in the act of interrupting the cycle. Of standing at the edge of a legacy soaked in pain and saying, it ends with me. But here's the truth. Not every curse wants to be broken. Some fight back, not with violence, but with doubt. The night after you begin the work, you may dream of a relative crying, or find yourself inexplicably angry or afraid. Some feel sick for days. Others hear whispers or experience strange coincidences. This isn't punishment, it's resistance. The pattern trying to survive. And sometimes it works. People stop. They convince themselves they were imagining things. They go back to their old habits. And the curse sighs and settles back in. Waiting. Because that's the final test. Not whether you can see the curse, but whether you can hold your ground when it tries to pull you back. Whether you can speak kindly to yourself when the voice inside tells you you're doomed. Whether you can keep going when your family says, "Why bring that up again?" The hardest part of breaking a bloodline curse isn't the pain. It's the isolation. It's becoming the one who changes. And in doing so, no longer fits where you came from. But this is also the gift. Because on the other side of that severance is freedom. Not the kind people sell you. The kind you remember. The kind that feels like waking up in a life that finally belongs to you. And when that moment comes, when the old pattern tries to pull you back and you no longer respond, you'll know. You broke it. And maybe someone in your line, long gone, will finally rest because of it. If this story echoed something in you, if you felt yourself nodding without knowing why, you're not alone. Tell me what you've seen, repeat, what you've felt that couldn't be explained. Share it in the comments. Your story might be the piece someone else needs to remember their own. And if you want more forbidden histories, haunted truths, and rituals that slip between the cracks of memory, like this video, subscribe to the channel and return with me to the library. Some legacies are chosen, others are broken, and some begin right here.